Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how to periodize resisted sprinting for maximal transfer to sprint performance. Before delving into how we can train using resisted sprints, we first need to have a look at some of the types of resisted sprinting that there are. The first form of resisted sprinting we have is uphill sprints. Sprinting up a hill is the simplest way to provide higher force demands to an athlete. Uphill sprints are extremely easy to implement since athletes can get the benefit from the exercise with essentially zero cueing required. The athletes simply have to sprint with maximal effort up the hill. There is also no equipment required, so athletes can perform the sprints with no setup or changing of equipment. This is great for groups where the coach cannot individually assist every athlete at all times, and the group can get through their sprints quite quickly. However, some potential issues with hill sprints are that it is a one-size-fits-all exercise, meaning that the resistance or the distance cannot change unless you have access to multiple hills with different gradients and lengths. It is also very difficult to find a smooth hill that is in a convenient location. If the hill is not close to the gym or a field, then other training cannot be performed other than hill sprints. The next form of resisted sprints we will discuss is parachutes. Parachute sprints use the wind to apply resistance to sprints. So when the athlete runs, the parachute drags through the air and slows down the speed of the sprint. Parachutes are a very accessible way to provide resistance to sprinting. They are very lightweight and can be stored in a very small box or bag, making them easy to transport. So parachutes can be taken to any track or field very easily, and resisted sprints can be performed. They are generally very cheap, so multiple of them can be purchased to be used for teams or groups. They are also quite easy to use. The athlete simply must strap on the harness, and they then sprint with maximal effort. However, parachute sprints have a similar issue to the hill sprints. They only provide one level of resistance. Although the distance of the sprints can easily be altered, the amount of resistance cannot. This makes it difficult to progress and periodize over time. The next form of resisted sprints we have are sled pulls. Sled pulls use a harness attached to the athlete with a loaded sled attached to the other end of a rope or a cord. The athlete then sprints with maximal effort for the desired distance. Sled pulls are a great method to use for resisted sprints since the load can be changed by adding or reducing the weight on the sled. So both the distance of the sprints and the resistance applied can be manipulated. This allows the coach or athlete to effectively progress and periodize the resisted sprint training. However, sled pulls are somewhat inconvenient to train with in certain situations. They are heavy and take up more storage space, so they are difficult to transport if training is conducted off-site. Plus, the need for weights to load the sled means that more weight and more space needs to be transported. The other issue is that sled pulls may be difficult to use with groups. This is because using multiple sleds are both expensive to purchase and difficult to transport. A less common form of resisted sprint training is the exogeny. The exogeny uses a rope which runs through a small channel which can be tightened or loosened to change the resistance on the rope. The tighter the channel is, the more resistance on the rope, and therefore the harder it is to pull the rope. The other end is attached to the athlete's waist via a harness. The athlete then sets the resistance they want and runs with maximal effort. The exogeny is lightweight, compact, and only needs to be secured to an immovable object to be used. This makes it highly portable and can be used almost anywhere. The resistance can be altered by turning a dial to the setting that is desired, so no additional weights are required. The only issue with the exogeny is the cost. A single device costs around $370, making it unaffordable for most people to purchase. This makes it not only unrealistic to be used for an individual, but is highly unlikely that multiple would be purchased for a group or a team to use. So now that we have explored some of the different forms of resisted sprinting, let's now understand how it can be beneficial to unloaded sprint performance. Resisted sprint training is the most specific form of training that athletes can do to enhance sprint performance, apart from traditional unloaded sprints. This means that resisted sprints probably have the highest direct transfer to, and to the most closely related to, sprint performance. So if an athlete can improve their running speed with resistance, they will likely increase their unloaded sprint performance too. Adding additional resistance to a sprint does two things. One, it slows the potential running speed of the athlete, and two, it increases the force demands for the athlete. So essentially, resisted sprints require longer contact times with the ground and higher forces to be produced. This in a way acts as a highly specific strength training for sprinters. If an athlete can produce higher forces in the same or less time, then they are likely to be faster. So how effective are resisted sprints, and how much transfer can they have to unloaded performance? Since this type of training involves higher force outputs with longer ground contact times, it replicates the action seen during the early acceleration phase of a sprint, during the first 10 to 20 meters. So resisted sprints generally have the highest transfer to acceleration performance and less transfer to maximum velocity performance. It also needs to be understood that the more resistance used, the less specific it becomes. Therefore, higher resistances generally have less transfer to performance, while lower resistances have more transfer. This brings us to the concept of periodization. First, we need to understand how to periodize the loading of resisted sprint training. High resistances demand high forces with slower movement speeds. This is great for building a strength base, but not the best for running as fast as possible. On the other hand, lower resistances are more specific to unloaded sprints and will have higher direct transfer to performance. Therefore, it is probably best to use heavier resistances further from when the athlete needs to peak, and lighter resistances closer to when the athlete needs to peak. We also need to understand how to periodize the distances of the resistance sprints. This should be logically progressed in accordance with the loading used. When using heavier loads, the intention is maximal force output, so shorter distances are probably best to be used, as the athlete won't be able to perform very heavy resisted sprints with maximal output for far distances. When we are using lighter resistance, the goal is maximum velocity. Therefore, longer distances should be used to allow higher velocities to be reached. So to summarize how resisted sprints can be periodized, we start with heavy loads and shorter distances further from the athlete's peak, and transition to lighter loads with longer distances closer to the athlete's peak. Here is an example of how this may look. Let's use a 12-week time frame where the athlete wants to be in peak sprinting condition at the end of the 12 weeks. We will split this 12-week period into 3 blocks of 4 weeks. Using a sled pull as an example exercise, the first block may look something like this. We start with heavy loads on the sled and shorter distances. The load stays the same for the entire block, although the distances increase slightly each week. This will focus on force production in the specific movement pattern of sprinting, but won't emphasize the velocity-based training qualities. The second block may use a moderate load with slightly longer distances. This will allow the athlete to travel slightly faster and become slightly more specific to unloaded sprinting. Once again, the distances increase over the block, but the load remains the same. And in the last 4-week block, the athlete may use a light load, which will only slow the athlete down slightly compared to regular sprints. The distances progress each week and are longer than the previous 2 blocks. This will allow the athlete to reach a higher max speed, making it the most specific to regular sprinting. This should have the highest transfer to unloaded sprint performance just at the right time when the athlete needs to peak. And the last consideration to cover is how resisted sprints should be structured into a speed or strength and conditioning training session. Since resisted sprints are a form of sprint training, it is important that they are executed with absolutely maximal intent, regardless of the load being used. Therefore, it should be implemented towards the beginning of the session so that fatigue is low, and the athlete can put high effort into the exercise. It is recommended that resisted sprints should follow regular unloaded sprints in the training session. So if unloaded sprints are performed first, then resisted sprints can follow. This should be performed before plyometrics, power, strength, or endurance training to allow for minimal fatigue to interfere with the sprints. For example, in the case of a sprint-specific training session, the structure may look something like this. The regular sprints are performed first, followed by resisted sprints, followed by plyometrics. In the case of a strength and conditioning session for a team, the structure may look something like this. The unloaded sprints performed first, followed by resisted sprints, followed by plyometrics, power, and strength training. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.